If you can have a gross margin advantage relative to your competition and you are willing to invest in your business, you have an edge. Now, the other thing you could do is you can grow your cash. So there are only three numbers, in my opinion, that matter. And you're going to hear this concept of time and money over and over again as I speak. We only have time and money, and how we spend it is what gives us the greatest return. And those that you measure are those that get managed.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the Small Business Mentor podcast, where we shine a light on the black holes of business growth with your host, Alan Pence. In each episode, we explore the leaps and bounds entrepreneurs make as they push their businesses beyond the 1 million mark into the realm of professional sustainable growth. Stay with us as we navigate the journey from brute force to finesse.
Hey, all right. So today we have a very cool financially focused episode with Jon Morris. He is the founder and CEO of Fiscal Advocate, also Rise as well. He's got a couple of companies under his banner. So Jon, welcome to the podcast and tell us a little bit about your background and how you got here.
Yeah, so I've actually been a digital marketer and entrepreneur for the vast majority of my career. And I founded, as you mentioned, Rise Interactive in 2004. I grew it from winning $10,000 in prize money to a $37 million digital marketing agency with about 250 employees. And I sold it, stepped down right in the beginning of the pandemic in April, and started Fiscal Advocate basically right after that. And a big part of the success of Rise was how we made decisions based on the financial numbers. And I thought about it, and I thought it'd be really fun to help other people do the same thing. And so Fiscal Advocate is a tech-enabled finance management company for professional service companies. So we help them with all their back office in terms of the bookkeeping, the paying your bills, all the stuff that the finance department does. But where we really specialize is in this area called financial planning and analysis. And if you think about a business or a business owner, all we have is time and money. And my favorite thing about being a CEO is that we have all this great inputs and we have to make black or white decisions. And then the outcome is black and white. You're either growing your company, you're either increasing profits, you're either increasing cash, or you're not. And so understanding how to leverage financial data to spend your time and money more intelligently was the key to my success at Rise, and it's what I'm now trying to help other people do the same thing with.
That's fascinating. So obviously a good exit from Rise. So just going into that, like you talked about the financial piece being so important, talk about how that really drove the success of the business, like in a little more detail.
Sure. So I've now probably looked at the financials of hundreds, maybe even approaching thousands of companies. And most of them are professional service companies. So they sell time or people as like the main product. And the first number that people don't understand is what gross margin is, or you are familiar with it as contribution margin. So if someone hires you to do work, how much cost does it take for you to do that work? So just imagine if your revenue is $10 million and it costs you $7 million to actually deliver for that $10 million worth of work. Well, then you have a 30% gross margin or contribution margin. And by the way, that's a fully loaded number. That includes your payroll, your freelancers, travel and entertainment, technology, anything that relates to client work. And the reason why this is such an important number is because if you can deliver for your clients at a 50% gross margin, that means you have $5 million out of that 10 to go invest back in your business or put in your pocket. Where if you have a 30% gross margin, you only have $3 million. So one of the metrics we highly focused on was just what is that gross margin? When I left Rise, I was working on what I called Project 60%. And we were really working on automating a bunch of the time of things that we were doing so that we could not lower the quality of work, actually increase the quality of work for our clients, but do it in a more profitable manner.
That's spooky, Joe. It's like, I haven't targeted that, but that's 100% what we're trying to do right now is we're doing it with offshore and automation, but it's all about getting that gross margin.
We had nearshore development as well as automation. I had a 25-person product development team. That team's up to 55 people now. So it's grown quite a bit. That was one number. The second number is people come to me all the time. They're like, hey, Jon, I really want to grow faster. And I always follow up with like, that's awesome. Let me ask you one quick question. What percent of your revenue do you spend on sales and marketing? And I generally go, oh, I don't spend anything in sales and marketing. It's all word of mouth. And so my response is, then you don't really want to grow faster. One of the things I love about what I do is that we do budgeting and forecasting. And what I explain to people is your budget is your strategic plan. It tells me exactly what is important to you because that's what you're spending your time and money on. And so when you look at that, if you want to grow faster, you have to spend money on sales and marketing. A typical professional service company spends 8% of their revenue on sales and marketing. So how do we get you to spend 15%? If I want you to have a 50% gross margin, I can get you to 55% gross margin. That gives you 5 percentage points that you can invest in sales and marketing without impacting your profit target. And so understanding there's really not that many buckets. There's your cost of service, which is the cost to deliver the work. There is then all of your non-client related expenses. I call that SG&A. I didn't make that up. It's a GAAP accounting term. But there are only 4 buckets that your SG&A goes into. So the first one is sales and marketing. That is all about generating new logos and generating new revenue. The next one is operations and finance. And that is your finance department, HR, legal, corporate IT, and general administrative expenses. So for example, Alan, facilities would go under general administrative expenses. And then the third one is your executive team. And then the fourth one is R&D. And if you do R&D right, that actually can become a capitalized and show up on your balance sheet as opposed to your income statement. But you get 30% for your SG&A. You get 50% to deliver for your customers, and then you get to put 20% in your pocket.
So that is the classic professional services firm. I'm sure it breaks out a little differently if you're doing SaaS software or something like that. But essentially like a 15 to 20% profitability business. What I'd never heard before is people really breaking down that 30% of the SG&A, which, we have like indirect and overheads and government contracting and stuff like that. But it's interesting to hear like, all right, 8% for sales and marketing. And then what do you see in those other 4 buckets?
15% for operations and finance, 7% for your executive team. Most people spend 0 on R&D. I recommend 5% of your revenue goes to R&D, but I recommend that we try to treat that as a capitalized expense. So it doesn't come out of that 30%, but it does deplete your cash reserves.
Okay. And so then one of your ideas is how do we do more on the direct labor side to automate, offset, so I can go from 50 to 55 to 60, and then I can redeploy that additional 5 or 10% into sales and R&D. Is that the idea?
Exactly. So you can grow, like if you take like a software company's gross margin typically 70% or greater, and they spend like 20% of their revenue on marketing because they have so much more margin that allows them to spend more money on marketing. So if you can have a gross margin advantage relative to your competition and you are willing to invest in your business, you have an edge. Now, the other thing you could do is you can grow your cash. So there are only 3 numbers, in my opinion, that matter. And you're going to hear this concept of time and money over and over again as I speak. We only have time and money, and how we spend it is what gets us the greatest return. And those that you measure are those that get managed. And I think Peter Drucker is the one who mentioned that, line. So the 3 KPIs that I recommend people follow is the first one is how much cash you have relative to monthly overhead. I want you to have about 2 to 2.5 times your monthly overhead in cash at a minimum.
That's hilarious because I was talking to you a little bit about Greg Crabtree before that. 2 months, he calls it 2 months core cap for sure, unless you're seasonal and then you have to have more. It's just amazing how these, the numbers don't lie.
No, they don't. And look, I haven't read his book yet, but I've read a ton of the books. And, every once in a while I pick up something slightly new, but for the most part, we're all speaking the same language. But I'll just tell you, like, one of my favorite stories is Microsoft bought LinkedIn for $26.2 billion in an all-cash deal. If you have lots of cash, you have lots of optionality. You get to do really cool things. You get to buy fun stuff. And so I put a huge emphasis on growing your cash. I can say this, 99% of the companies I meet with and I talk to before they start working with me do not have enough cash. I also explain that it is a journey. It's not a light switch. So a lot of people hear that they don't have enough cash and then they're like, oh my God, I need $1 million and I have $100,000. And I explain, well, let's over the next 2 years build up your cash. A lot of times the reason why people don't have enough cash is they're taking all the cash out in distributions and is assuming they're profitable. And, it's not like all of a sudden you could just cut their personal lifestyle. So it's like we have to have a conversation of like, well, can we get some of the cash to stay in the business? So there's strategic conversations you need to have. The second metric, which we've talked about, is the 20%, is your profit margin. What percent of your revenue is EBITDA? EBITDA is a fancy word for profit. So it means profit before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. But if you're listening to this and you don't want to get into all the technical aspects, just think of the word as profit. I want your profit to be 20% of revenue. Now, for many, many years at Rise, I targeted 5% profit as opposed to 20%. And I am fine if you want to have a lower profit target, provided you're using that money to invest in sales and marketing or you're using that money to invest in R&D. But I'm also only okay with it is if you see the growth in the numbers. Rise went from 1 million to 2 to 4 to 8 to 12 to 13 to 19 to 24 to, it just kept on going up and up and up. And so my investments in sales and marketing was paying off and my investments in R&D was paying off. However, I was going from 1 million to 1 million to 1 million to 1 million. I'd be like, hey guys, the sales and marketing is not working. Let's just take the profits. So that's the second metric. The third metric is year-over-year revenue growth. I want you to have 20% year-over-year revenue growth. That is considered the industry standard. Like I said, that is considered to be at the highest level performance of a professional service company. And it becomes harder, as you go from 1 million to 1.2 million, that might not be that hard, but to go from 10 million to 12 million is harder because you're adding $2 million of incremental revenue. So as you get bigger, that 20% growth becomes more challenging. And that's also where by building your cash reserves, you can have an indirect and a direct method in terms of acquisition versus growing organically. But those are the three numbers that I want you to hold to. Now, I get people to ask me all the time, like, Jon, what about employee churn or client churn or some other KPI? Every KPI should be able to roll up to one of those three KPIs.
It makes total sense, right? I like the simplicity of it. So a couple of things I wanted to dive in on. So first on the sales and marketing. So have these conversations all the time. We have a sales team in government contracting. They're great. But my sales team is like a binary outcome every year. It's like you either win a bunch of stuff in August and September, right when the fiscal year of the government's ending, or you don't win anything. And it's like that day. It's like almost even on a day. You think everything comes in or doesn't. So one thing is how long, different people have different sales cycles. How long do you keep investing before you say, oh, this isn't working? On the sales side would be one question. And then I have one on marketing.
What I would say is, first question you have is what you're doing scalable? If you are getting a bunch of government contracts, they make decisions in August, and you're like, hey, if I add more water to this, I can get double the amount of customers, then I would say, let's do it. At some point, though, you're going to hit a plateau. And we're going to say, hey, if I'm spending $1 million a year and I go to $2 million a year doing the exact same thing, I'm going to get the exact same outcome. Well, then I don't want you to do that. But then what I do want you to do is put a testing budget together to find the next big thing. And you got to be comfortable understanding that some of that or most of that money might be wasted. Where people, I think, run into problems is when they test something new and they put that in the numbers of okay, I'm going to go try sponsoring these 5 conferences I've never gone to before, and therefore I'm going to add $1 million in new business because I'm sponsoring all these conferences. But we've never done it before. We don't know if it works. And so what we have to recognize is this is a test that we hope works, but I get very concerned when people add a bunch of revenue from sources that they don't know where it comes from, because the second they see more revenue, they start ramping up expenses accordingly. And so we need to constantly test to find what works. And then when you find out what works, you go from there.
So in some ways, there's an R&D budget over here on new products or services, but there's also like potentially like a experiment budget within sales and marketing, right? That you need to, like I was talking to a business yesterday that does like a medical procedure, and they do alliances with medical systems to get referrals, right? But they don't do anything on like Google advertising or digital advertising at all. And so it's like, all right, you need to start testing that, and like, but you can't test everything all at once, right? Because then you don't know. To some extent with digital marketing, you might know where it comes in from, but
Generally, I recommend 2 or 3 things that you test, and you get enough data. I always tell people spend the minimal amount of money possible to get enough data to know if this is something you want to invest in.
okay, so that's a good thing. So then going back to the cash piece, okay, you had said, the more cash you have, more flexibility you have, which is true. But do you also see it as like a bunch of money that someone's going to waste because there's too much of it sitting around?
That really comes just down to the discipline of the leader. My job is to be a financial steward of your business. And if you have a lot of cash, I want to make sure that we're not just being stupid with the cash, like that. Once again, we only have time and money. So we still got to treat that time and money really intelligently and make sure that you're running your business as lean as possible, but you're also going to make investments using that cash. So like, I'll just give you an example. Here are things you can use that cash for. You can invest in improving your current service offering, and you can do something called service design, which is, how do you make the services better? You can invest in a technology component and say, hey, you know what, we're going to build technology. Or you can actually have an M&A strategy and say, you know what, let's go grow through, acquisition. And when you grow through acquisition, what I always tell people is start with the press release of what you want to write. So it might be like, we've expanded to Europe, or it could be that, we go after these government businesses and we needed to add a new service and we've expanded our service offering for government companies. Or it could be, we are going into a new vertical and we're going to go attack this other vertical and we bought a company to go after that vertical. There's generally not, it's generally either geographic, service expansion, vertical expansion, or it's just domination within a current service offering that you have and be like, let's go be the largest player on this one service. So if you have that thesis in mind, then you can make sure that you're deploying your cash in a strategic manner.
So as you grew Rise, right, you said you got up to 37 million in revenue from 10, and how that was like a 10, 15 year process, I would assume, something like that. So before exiting. So is there any like trajectory you would say is like, all right, early on, before I got to here, I focused on these sort of investments and then I focused on others? Or was it a consistent way of doing it all the way through those barriers?
That's a great question. So the first thing I would tell people is different people have different philosophies. I focus on building a great business. I had a 20-year time horizon with Rise. I only did it for 16, but my intent was 20 years. I have a 20-year time horizon for Fiscal Advocate. I want to build something special and long-lasting, and I deeply care about my employees. I deeply care about my clients, and I want to first make sure that I'm delivering for that group of people. The second thing is, in a professional service company, there's only 4 major buckets. Okay, you have sales and marketing, you have your operations and finance, you have R&D, and then you have client service. Client service is all the people that deliver for your customers. And so what you want to do as the CEO of the company is over time is relinquish control and find other people to take those specific seats. The path is going to be different based on the company. I happen to be very good at sales. So I might find someone to run all the client work so I can go bring in new customers. Someone else might be great at client work, but sucks at sales. So they might want to say like, you know what, before I relinquish doing client work, let me go find a salesperson. And so what you want to do is make investments in those 4 areas. The other thing that I would say is, if you think about a all of us, when we are in sales, is we are promise makers. We tell everybody how everything is going to be so wonderful. And then they actually get to experience the product or the service you're selling. And those are your promise keepers. I believe that the promise keeper should do a better job in terms of the experience and the results than whatever the salesperson delivered. And so I'm a huge believer in investing constantly in your product and your service so that it's truly a world-class solution. Now, that doesn't mean that it's always world-class, but it's this pursuit of world-class, that you're making it better and better over time. Because then when you win business, everyone's going to lose customers, but you want to lose customers for things out of your control as opposed to within your control.
That's great. And so for you, did you see deterioration in investment over time? Like more, if you did more salespeople or more whatever, did you see that go down and then have to do other things? Or were you able to consistently invest?
I mean, no matter what I did is I would learn from the investments I make, but then I would double down in different areas. So I was very big in investing. So I'll give you an example. I spent about $1 million a year in just my sales team. I had a phenomenal year one. My $1 million investment would generally increase my revenue by about $6 million. So for every million I spent, I would get $6 million in return. One year I decided, you know what, this is going well, I'm going to go double it. And I went from 1 million to 2 million. I generated $6 million in incremental business. There's no value to that extra $1 million. So in hindsight, what I would have done differently is I wouldn't have been so aggressive of going from 1 to 2. I would have gone from 1 to maybe 1.2. You know what I'm saying? Like, let's start with a smaller investment and see if it scales. But you can either say, hey, you know what? I'm happy with $6 million in incremental sales. Or I can say, I'm going to try something new because I really want to get to $10 million in incremental sales. So going from 1 million to 2, doing the exact same thing didn't work, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other things you can try. You know, so I want you to keep on thinking about if something fails, what are you going to do? Rise has a world-class media optimization platform called Connects. Before Connects, we built a tool called Clearview. And, you know, I took a really smart digital marketer and put them in charge of technology. And what you found is that really good technologists are different than really good digital marketers. And the code base was not scalable, and we had to start over. And that was $1 million investment that I had to make a strategic decision. Am I going to go do this and make sure that I have technology as a play to differentiate ourselves? Or am I going to not make this investment? I chose to make the investment. I then went and hired someone that really knows how to build technology. And then we built a team under that person. And that became a massive differentiator for us in terms of how we could win new business.
This is often, you know, in professional services firms, people want to build technology. And it often turns into a disaster. So talk a little bit about, so, you know, you've tried it with someone internal and they're like, hey, like this person doesn't know how to run technology, right? So that's often a key mistake. It's often paying too much, you know, in development. You don't have a specific thing that you know exactly what you want. And so talk a little bit about how you managed that and made it successful.
So there's a couple things. First of all, the mindset of a service-based owner is different than the mindset of a product owner. We are very used to being in a pitch as a service-based company of proposing things in the gray. So it's like, hey, you know, I've done these projects. These guys need something slightly a little bit different than what we've done before, but I'm pretty sure I can get it done. And you'll put the proposal together and you'll submit it. With technology, it doesn't work that way. Like, you got to come up with what features are being built. It takes a long time to build these features. You know, little things that you're like, why does it take so long to build? It's because one small thing might take 4 weeks to build, you know, and it just adds up. So that's one thing. The second thing is there's a whole methodology of how you do what is called sprint cycles, which are like 2-week time periods of building technology. And you need to make sure that you have like the UX person, the QA person, the software developers, front end or back end engineers, and then you need a product manager who can help prioritize what you're building to make sure it adds the most amount of value. You know, and I didn't understand all this until I hired like Brent Laufenberg, who was the CTO at Rise. And I learned so much from him about how to build product in a world-class fashion. So the one thing that I tell people about building technology is First of all, especially in the first year or two, the value that you provide your clients is very low for the technology you build. You might have to be building out your database and just the infrastructure. I remember when Brett came to me first, he's like, it's going to take 6 months to just build out all the infrastructure. And I'm used to, like, I submit a proposal, I start working right away. So it is a long game. The second thing is it's very capital intensive. If you want to build and you want to build quickly, like you need people to do that. So the third thing I would say is you want to make sure that your client base is very standardized and that your service offering is very standardized. I'll just give you a real good example at Rise. Rise was a generalist agency. We had B2B, we had B2C, we had lead gen, we had e-commerce, we had branding. And so by being so wide, when we would do an innovation, the impact was not to the entire organization. So I'll give you an example. You can advertise on Amazon, and there's a whole thing called marketplaces where it's like advertising at Amazon, at Target, at Walmart. So we did integrations with all of these marketplaces. However, that might only be 10 to 20% of our client base that is actually advertising on Amazon. So the benefit is to a small subgroup, where same thing, like if we did a LinkedIn integration, that's great for our B2B lead gen companies, but it's not good for our e-commerce companies. And so generally what I recommend is that you pick a vertical that you're going after. You make sure that your sales and your marketing are aligned towards going after that vertical and that your innovation is going after that vertical. So even if your technology doesn't help everybody, it's all aligned strategically with how you want to invest and grow your business.
That's fascinating. So, and do you did you view it at Rise as like a tech-enabled service first and not a product-led service behind it kind of thing?
Exactly. I think that they license the technology today, but I'm not positive. I've been gone for 4 years, but you couldn't license the technology. You would have to be a client of ours, and then you would get access to the technology by being a client. We're at Fiscal Advocate, we provide financial management solutions for professional service companies. One of those solutions is you can just license the technology directly. So if you have an internal finance department and you have a group that does what's called FP&A, financial planning and analysis, we are a tool that you can use. But if you don't have that and you're like, you know what, I need help putting the budgets together and all the strategy and things like that, then we provide those solutions as well. So it's a little bit of a hybrid in that scenario.
That's great. Just curious, you'd mentioned revenue growth at 20% at the high performing. So what do you think happens to professional services companies when they grow at 100%? Is that sustainable?
Look, I went from 1 million to 2 million and 2 million to 4 million, but then I went from 4 to 8. And so if you look at going from 2 to 4, I added $2 million in incremental revenue, where when I went from 4 to 8, I added 4 million in incremental revenue. But then the next year I went from 8 to 12, but there's only a 50% growth rate. So as you scale, it becomes harder and harder to put up that 20% number. If you take like the massive holding companies of marketing agencies, so like Publicis or Omnicom or IPG, they grow at like the rate of GDP because they're like $20 billion. So at some point, the 20% number becomes a 10% number. You know what I mean? Like you get to a scale where...
Right. But there's nothing about 100% growth that like definitely the company's going to break down if you're growing at that kind of rate.
It really depends on the infrastructure of the business. So I'll give an example. There are companies that are the exact same size as me, but I have resources in sales, I have resources in marketing, I have resources on my product development team, I have resources on my operations side. And so I can recruit and bring in talent. I can go out there to go win more business. And these other companies, they have like no infrastructure whatsoever. It's like literally they deliver client work and the CEO is getting a great distribution and they're getting paid really well. Their EBITDA is higher than 20%, but it's going to be really hard for them to scale because you have to hire a lot of people. When you're growing, like if you're going from 2 million to 4 million, you're going from, let's just say 20 employees to 40 employees. And so you have to hire 20 people. And not only that, but you're probably going to lose 4 or 5 of those initial 20. So you probably have to hire 25 people. And so do you have the recruiting infrastructure to interview, make decisions, onboard, train, and do all of those things that go along with it.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, the management infrastructure to correct when they come in and oversee them. And like we've seen this multiple times in our growth path, and I've seen it in other companies. And it is true, like to some extent, some amount of scaling your internal resources before you scale sales works best, but it's super dangerous because that growth doesn't come, you're stuck with low profit margins, right? So you've got to be, what I always say is it's not easy. And that's why you make 20% profits, right? Because it's hard. It's a hard thing to do to figure that out.
What I would also say is if you're going to grow, really make sure that your product and your service offering is at a high enough quality that you're not going to be eroding trust and brand. I'll have full candor in this new business. I think it was a little bit ego driven, just to be honest about myself. I wanted to kind of replicate what I did at Rise. And I think I was too aggressive at selling right away when the product wasn't completely ready to be sold. And I think what I should have done is probably spent the first year getting beta customers and working out the kinks and letting them know that you're dealing with this in year one and not worry about the revenue. And then in year two, like, okay, the product's finally in a place where I feel good about it. Let's go add a little bit more, take a more incremental approach as opposed to just go guns blazing. Like, I feel like today we have such a world-class offering that there's no reason we couldn't double for many times over and our team couldn't support it.
Right. And that's the advantage, I think, of a product. Once you resolve that technical debt in the beginning and really get it dialed down, then scales much more quickly, right?
But even on the service side, like we have the processes in place, we have the team in place, we have a lot of really great things.
So let's talk a little bit about Fiscal Advocate. We took a quick look at the product before we talked. It really embeds this sort of logic and set of principles that you've talked about into a piece of software, right? So talk about what clients are looking at or users are looking at on a monthly basis or whatever it is.
Yeah, so the technology is called Engine BI. And if you remember, there are 3 KPIs that matter: your cash relative to your monthly overhead, your profit margin, and your year-over-year revenue growth. Now, what's great about the software is it is a backwards-looking analysis and a forward-looking analysis tool. So, for example, one of the most important things that any professional service company can do in order to make sure you hit that 20% EBITDA is really understand what your revenue looks like over the next 30, 60, 90 days. And if that revenue is lower than what you thought it would be, you need to take costs out of the business. And if it's higher, then you need to ramp up and make investments. And so it's a full budgeting and forecasting software. It comes with a methodology that I wrote on how to do budgeting and forecasting, because you can't do forward-looking analysis without really strong budgeting and forecasting principles. The second thing is it's a benchmarking tool. So it tells you how much to spend in those buckets that I sent you, and it's getting more and more granular. So it's like, you should spend 5% on your finance department. You should spend 4.5% on your HR department. And it gives you the targets for how much you should spend in each one of these specific areas. Then from there, it also is just a business intelligence tool. So it automates your month-end analysis in terms of what I want every company to do. Our businesses, professional service companies, businesses really run on a monthly cadence. And when you close the books, ideally you're closing the books by the 10th business day at the latest of the next month. And so tomorrow's the last day of August. I would want whatever the 10th business day of September is, your books are closed, and that includes the analysis. And then the decisions that you're trying to make based on that analysis is, what do I need to do based on my year-to-date analysis, my last month analysis, my quarter-to-date analysis, as well as what my forecast looks like in terms of how do I spend my time and my money more intelligently. And I want you to make decisions that are related to your cash, your profit, and your revenue. And the only other thing I would say is you have to have a crazy sense of urgency. I'm going to give you an example. There's a competitor of mine. The competitor is substantially larger. They've been around for many, many years. And we just took a client of theirs. And I got to see all the reports that they were giving the client. And I'll tell you this, the reports were great. The way they structured their analysis was great. But yet the company was losing money for 12 months in a row. And so either they were providing insights, but not the right sense of urgency, or they weren't providing insights. So like in this scenario, the company had a glaring gross margin problem. If your gross margin is below 40%, you're going to lose money. If your gross margin is between 40 and 50%, you're going to decide between making money or investing in the business. If it's between 50 and 60%, you're going to have a really profitable business and be able to invest. And if it's above 60%, somebody's getting screwed. You're either burning out your employees or you're not delivering for your customers.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to capture that. Do you have that in a graphic? I think that's perfect.
I'll make a graphic of it.
That's perfect. I love that. 30%, you're not making money. 40%, you can either invest or...
Under 40%, you're not making money. Between 40 and 50%, you are choosing between investing your business or making money. 50 to 60%, you are profitable and you can invest in the business. And 60% or greater, someone's getting screwed. Either your employees and you're burning them out or you're under delivering for your customers. And so in this case, they were sub 40% in gross margin. And then if you looked at like the entry-level salaries, were through the roof. Like it was just not a scalable business. They were paying way too much. And so they've been with us for 60 days and they're now profitable again. And so I'm a big believer in no one in the professional service world should be losing money. Our resources are our people, right? And you can adjust your people. You can hire more junior people. You can do nearshore development. There's all sorts of things you can do to get your cost structure in line. But if you see that you are losing money or that your profits are too low, you set a target and you have crazy sense of urgency to never fall below that target.
That's great. So this has been awesome, John. I know you've got a hard stop, but I think some really good rules to live by here. So if people want to reach out or learn about Fiscal Advocate, what's the best way to get to you?
You can follow me on LinkedIn. I post fairly regularly about insights on finance for professional service companies. I have a newsletter on LinkedIn called Fiscal Focus that you can also sign up for. You can also go to fiscaladvocate.com or you can email me at jon@fiscaladvocate.com.
That's great. John, thanks so much. This has been awesome.
This was awesome. Thank you for having me on here.
You've been listening to the Small Business Mentor podcast, brought to you by Alan Pence. For more insights on how to navigate your business through its black holes, visit @apence on X. Don't forget to search for Small Business Mentor in your podcast app to subscribe. Thank you for joining us, and here's to your next leap in business growth.